Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is spin. Let's take a moment to look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear spin used is to mean to rotate or cause something to rotate quickly, right? So rotate, you might think kind of making circles. And I have a chair that moves, so I'm going to try and spin in my chair. So that is what is meant by this first definition of the verb. Now, a second way the verb spin gets used is to describe a dizzy sensation that someone might have. I hope this hasn't happened to you, but certain illnesses might make you feel like, oh dear, the room is spinning, right? Which is another way to say I'm dizzy. A third way you'll hear the verb spin used is to mean to make thread or yarn by drawing it out and twisting the fibers. So if there are any crafters out there, maybe you've done this, but again, that idea of rotating is how this verb's meaning kind of connects to the overall picture here. A fourth way the verb spin gets used is a bit more informal, but it can be to play music. I think this meaning comes back to us from when records were used, right? And so you might hear a certain DJ is spinning. They're playing music. They're kind of deciding what's going to be heard, maybe at a particular event or party. A fifth way the verb spin gets used is to talk about how certain insects form a web or a cocoon. I've got a picture of a spider web here, and we would describe that action of making or forming this web as spinning. A sixth way spin gets used is to mean to interpret a statement or an event in a particular way. And usually that particular way is very favorable. So with this sixth definition, I feel like we hear it used a lot in connection to politics. And we hear politicians spinning certain events, certain reports in a way that's going to either benefit them or their political party. You should know that spin is an irregular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, I'm going to have to double the ending consonant, double the N, before I add ing. And the reason I'm doing this is spin is a one-syllable verb that ends with consonant, vowel, consonant. I have a short vowel sound there, so I'm going to double the N before anytime, I should say. I'm going to add it, follow this rule anytime I'm adding a suffix that begins with a vowel letter. As for the past tense and participle forms of this verb, we're going to have a spelling change. It's the same second and third form here, but it's going to be spun, S-P-U-N. Okay. Now let's move on and talk about some phrasal verbs that are common with spin. The first is to spin around. So many times we're talking about someone turning and facing the opposite direction. Usually this is happening rather quickly. An example of this might be, the teacher spun around when she heard giggling from the back of the classroom. So maybe the teacher's helping a group of students in the front of the classroom or setting up the next activity. And as soon as she hears someone laughing or hears some voices laughing and giggling, right, she turns that head and to face the opposite direction and maybe figure out what's going on. Now, another phrasal verb you might encounter is to spin off. This can have a couple different meanings. One is where we're making one company or making a product from something larger. And I'd like us to look at the example sentence I have here to help us understand this. So, eBay spun off PayPal into its own publicly traded company in 2015. You may already know this, or this could be new information, but originally eBay and PayPal, these two services, right? They were all part of the same company, but we kind of took a portion of the company and made it its own. And that's what that sentence is describing. Now, a second way you hear spin-off used is in connection to TV shows. And so you might think of a TV show that is in existence, and maybe there's a character or a group of characters that are going to be taken from that first show, and a second or new TV show is going to be made from it. An example of this might be Better Call Saul was spun off from Breaking Bad. These are two American TV shows that have been fairly popular in recent times. The first show was Breaking Bad, and there's a particular character that was used in a second TV show. Another phrasal verb we might encounter is to spin out. This can have a couple different meanings. One would be to lose control of a vehicle. Let's take a look at this one in a sentence. Slow down on the slippery road or we'll spin out. Right, so someone here is trying to get someone to drive more cautiously so that they don't lose control. Another phrasal verb you might encounter is, or a second way I should say, to use spin out is to mean to make something last for a very long time. Maybe make it last as long as possible. Sometimes this gets used in a pretty negative way, like in my example here. He's been spinning this project out for weeks to avoid being assigned a new one. All right, so this is not a compliment, maybe not something to be proud of. Someone is trying to make one thing last in order to avoid more work. Now, let's take a look and practice our verb of the day in the simple present and the simple future. Today, we'll focus on will in the simple future, but let's talk about the simple present. We use this verb tense to talk about our habits and routines. We'll also use it to discuss facts. And when we're making simple present sentences, we really need to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, then we're just going to use the base verb. So there'll be no suffixes, no special endings with our verb. But if our subject is he, she, or it, so singular, right? Then I need to add an S to the end of the verb. And you can see that in my example sentence here. The washing machine's drum spins at a high speed and the pump drains the water. So this is this sentence is really expressing I guess describing facts here about how a washing machine works. So maybe you've seen video or other diagrams, right? But we can envision that rotating, right? All the water, the clothes that are hopefully clean, right, are spinning around and around. Now, if you want to make a negative sentence in the simple present, again, you've got to pay attention to the subject. The subject is I, you, we, or they. You're going to use do not and then the base verb. And if the subject is he, she, or it, you'll use does not and then the base verb. So notice I'm not adding an S to the end of my verb in the negative here. Okay, I'm only doing that in the affirmative. Here's another example sentence. Some species of male spiders don't spin webs. Again, another factual statement. Here, because we're talking about more than one species, that's why I'm using do not. So this is like saying they don't spin webs. If I had just been talking about one, right, then I would have used doesn't spin webs. So like this species or this type. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple present. To do this, I start with do or does, then I'm going to have my subject, and then I'll have the base verb. So again, with my yes and no questions, I'm not adding an S to the end of the verb. I'm only doing that in the affirmative when the subject is he, she, or it. Here's my last example. Does she spin her own yarn? Might be a question you hear if you're in a crafting community. Now let's talk about the simple future. Today we're going to make sentences using will. Will is very common as people make predictions, so kind of guesses about what they think will happen in the future. You'll also hear it with promises and with offers. You might occasionally hear it with people's plans, a little less common, but the nice thing about making sentences in the simple future with will is that our structure is going to stay the same no matter what the subject is. So in the affirmative, we'll have our subject, we'll use will, and then the base verb. You can see that in my example here. Several celebrity DJs will spin tunes at the festival throughout the weekend. Okay, this might be part of an advertisement you hear to get people excited about attending a particular festival. Now, if you want to make a negative sentence in the simple future, your structure is going to be to start with your subject, right? Then will not, and then the base verbs. The base verb. You might hear will not shortened into the contraction won't. You can see that in my example here. The blender blades won't spin. Okay, and this might not make a lot of sense. So I've included a little picture here, and I'll bring my cursor. So I'm talking about this little part here. They're very sharp blades, and most of the time, right, if you press a button on a blender, right, they're going to rotate very quickly. But for some reason, this isn't working, right? Now, if you want to make a yes or no question in the simple future, we can start with will, right? Then we'll have our subject and then the base verb. Here's my last example. Will the antique carousel ever spin again? So you might be familiar, or it might help to think of different amusement rides. So carousel usually has kind of like fancy horse-like structures, right? And they kind of rise and fall. And then the ride, right, moves in a rotation in a circular pattern. Okay? But there are many amusement rides that spin. Okay. Now we're going to take a moment to talk about one related word and one related phrase with our verb of the day, spin. And the first word we're going to talk about is just the noun form of this word. So the noun spin has exactly the same spelling and the exact same pronunciation. But it also has a number of different meanings. We're going to talk about a few of them today. The first way the noun spin gets used is to talk about rapid turning or a very quick whirling motion. An example of this might be, how many spins does the figure skater do in the air? Right? So maybe you've seen figure skaters. I am always continually impressed when they jump and then they rotate. They take their body, right, and rapidly turn. A second way the noun spin gets used is to describe the revolving motion that is put on a ball. Okay, and this is used most commonly in a variety of sports. So an example of this might be, look at the spin the tennis player puts on that shot. So really skilled athletes, I think in baseball and many other sports, right, can get a ball not to just move at a high rate of speed, but get it to rotate in a particular way that maybe makes it difficult for the opposition to make contact with it. Now, a third way the noun spin gets used is to talk about an uncontrolled, fast, revolving descent of an aircraft. This is kind of a sad definition, but you might see something in a news report that reads, the plane went into a spin before crashing. So again, that kind of idea we're rotating as it is descending, usually to the ground. A fourth way the noun spin gets used is to talk about a brief trip in a vehicle for pleasure. Here's an example. Do you want to take a spin in the convertible? Right? So maybe somebody has a new car, they want you to experience it. So let's take a ride is kind of another way to think of that. Another way the noun spin gets used is to talk about that particular interpretation that's many times intended to create a favorable impression as others become aware of it or as that information gets presented. So this goes back to that last definition of the verb we talked about earlier. An example might be, officials are putting a positive spin on the latest job figures, right? So they are interpreting, what does this mean? How many new jobs were added, or how many people are unemployed? And they're trying to create, again, many times a very favorable view of that information. Now, I think I've got one more phrase for us to talk about. Maybe you've heard someone say that someone is spinning their wheels. And many times, this is thought to describe the action of kind of wasting one's time or wasting their effort. So kind of this idea of your brain is working very hard, right? But you're not necessarily making progress, not moving forward with something. So I've had some bosses say something a bit similar to this example sentence. Don't spin your wheels too long looking for this old article. Oh, and I've got another typo here. This should be TOO, too long. My apologies. So the idea here, sometimes I was given research projects. We're like, I think I read a story once about blah, 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 right? And they'd say, can you find it? But occasionally they would say, but don't spend too much time, right? So don't spin your wheels. Don't waste a lot of time looking for this. If you can't find it, it's okay. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.